Welcome in, and tonight we are going to begin a four-part series on J.R.R. Tolkien's inspirations, and we are going to look at a lot of different things from Tolkien's life, the things that he read, the experiences that he had as he was growing up and during his young adult life and his adult life. We're going to look at his family history and the geography of the world that he lived in. And through all of these things, what we're going to try to do as a course of study is to get a little bit more understanding of where the writing that we love so much comes from. Everybody has probably heard of Tolkien when we look at things like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, which are two of his largest works that are going to be almost instantly recognizable. But there are quite a few of other things that he actually wrote that are academic in nature, that are also fictional in nature, that have nothing to do with Middle Earth, and we'll talk about a lot of that stuff as well. And tonight in part one, what we're going to do our best to try to explain is a little bit about how Tolkien thought about himself. And that might not seem necessarily to be the largest of inspirations, but it actually is sort of crucial to understanding how Tolkien wrote and thought and went about his creative process. And his identity is going to be something that he feels very strongly about and that he sort of acts out to the world as he goes about his life. And this is mostly going to be wrapped up in his family history and how he felt like he fit into the world that he lived in. So we're going to begin tonight by talking a little bit about where he came from, and we'll focus a lot in tonight's discussion on some of the earlier parts of his life. And if that's not exactly something that you were excited about, hang on for the next couple of streams. We'll get through everything, and we'll have a good time along the way. So where to begin? Well, we have to sort of start at the beginning, and the beginning is with his father and mother. This is a photograph of his father. His father's name is Arthur, and Arthur was an interesting individual. He had been in a bit of a financial mess. His family was not as well off as they used to be, and he was forced into finding a new job for himself, which lands him in the role of banker. And specifically, he gets into a branch of the South African bank down in a city called Bloemfontein. And that is where he is going to end up working for the majority of his early adult life. And this is also where he's going to ask for this lady, Mabel Suffield, to come and live with him. Now, they get married actually in Cape Town. Mabel Suffield was from a family that was in a little bit of a better position, perhaps, than Arthur. They had been under a lot of the same financial stresses. They used to be very, very wealthy and had been through some financially rough times and had recovered. But Arthur and Mabel are going to get married in South Africa, and they're going to live down there. And on January 3rd of 1892, they are going to give birth to baby Ronald. Now, Ronald, of course, is his given name, but his full name is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And he'll have lots of nicknames over the course of his life, but most of the people in his personal life and in his family are going to refer to him as Ronald. Now, you might think that living in South Africa in a period of time before it was a country was something that was, exciting and adventurous, but Ronald never really had a lot of very strong memories that came from that time period, mostly because he doesn't stay there for very long. There are a couple of things that might be worth noting, though. At one point in his toddler phase, he gets bitten on the foot by a large spider. And he claims that he doesn't remember this particular moment, but a lot of other people in his life sort of think, oh, this is where he sort of gets what might be a bit of a fear of spiders. We can't say for certain. We do know that he definitely remembers the very long wavy grass, though, and that's going to be something that comes back a little bit later when he writes stuff perhaps about the grass seas of Rohan. Now, one of the few things that he does sort of remember in passing from this time period are some trees that his father Arthur had planted behind their house, and this was something that he liked to go and play in. Of course, it's very, very hot in South Africa where he was located, and this is actually going to be part of the reason why he doesn't stay for very long. The heat is actually quite bad for his health. His brother Hilary is going to be born in 1894, and it's not even 6 months later that his mother decides to take the children back to England. Ronald's health had been fairly bad. Hilary, of course, being an infant, was, not necessarily easily handling the heat, and there had been very little opportunity for either Mabel or Arthur to return home since they had been married. And it sort of seemed like Mabel understood that Arthur was effectively married to his job a little bit at this point, and he had kept promising that we'll go home, we'll take a vacation, but things had already started coming up, and Arthur had received promotions and was now over a branch of the bank. And this is going to be a very fateful event. So in 1895, Mabel and Ronald and Hilary are going to move back to England, and they're going to live at a location that's called King's Heath. And King's Heath was the home of Mabel's family, the Suffields. And it was a rather large house, and there were lots of relations in the house, so there were multiple generations of the family that lived there. And Ronald is going to refer back to this early period of time when he first starts developing memories as a very homely feeling, like he was being sort of surrounded by love. And this concept of the homely house is one that will show up time and time again in Ronald's writings. Of course, he's going to relate this to other things that show up in various other types of writings, your mead halls and your rooms of learning and big libraries and things like that where you go hang out with all of your friends. These are all going to have effects on him, but the idea that there's a patriarch with lots of family running around, this is going to show up again when, for example, Tolkien goes on to describe certain parts of the Shire. For example, the old Took's house in the Shire, where you're lots of generations living in the same house, etc. Around this time, he is going to get to meet some of his Tolkien family members, but he's not particularly going to spend a lot of time with a lot of them. One in particular, though, is a lady named Gracie Tolkien, who was his aunt, and she was a bit of a teller of tales, and she told Ronald all of these stories about the origins of their last name, going all the way back to these stories that involved brave Christian Germans fighting against the Ottomans and receiving silly nicknames like Tolkien, which translates to foolhardy, and that being the basis of their name. And Ronald doesn't necessarily believe in any of these, but it does get him to think at a very young age about this lineage idea, how he fit into the larger world. And that is going to be a really important concept, because that's sort of going to affect the way that he ends up writing the world that he lives in. And this concept of the West Midlands of England, where the Suffields are going to live. Originally, they're from this place called Evesham, which is in Worcestershire, and they're going to have a lot of territory there, a lot of land, a lot of connections. And when Mabel decides to move out on their own, they're going to move to a place that's called Serral. Now, this is basically going to be the Shire. If we're being really honest and we look at what Serral represents, the region around it, including a little place called Moseley, both of these little areas are on the outskirts of the larger city, Birmingham. These are going to be the Shire. There is a river that runs through the middle of it. There is a mill that sits right on the river. This is actually a picture of the Serral Mill in Moseley. And if you know anything about the descriptions of the Shire when you first start reading it in Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit, you're going to notice that the mill plays a big role in both the naming of stuff. For example, Bywater, which is a little village that's right on the side of the water. And you're going to also hear stories about the miller and his son. And this is actually a picture from 1890 that survives, that shows the miller and his son from Serral. And what's interesting here is that even at a fairly young age, our very young boy Tolkien is already getting involved in what could be considered your everyday young boy shenanigans. And he and Hillary are already having little adventures where they go off and get into mischief and get into all sorts of adventures. And Tolkien, as a young boy, doesn't like the miller or his son. And if you've ever read Lord of the Rings, you might know that Ted Sandyman, the miller, and his sort of oppositional stance towards both Sam and Frodo are very prominent. And this is pretty clearly where it comes from, getting chased off by the miller. If you continue to read Lord of the Rings and you know anything about Farmer Maggot, who lives at this big farm called Bamfurlong, and you know that Frodo, as a young boy, was chased off the farm after sneaking in and stealing mushrooms, you might not be too particularly surprised to know that there was actually a mushroom farm nearby that would chase off a young Ronald and Hillary Tolkien. This particular area right around the what's called Bumble Dell in the city of Moseley, or the village of Moseley, is going to be one of the places where Ronald and Hillary sort of go off on their adventures, and getting into trouble and getting run off from these places is going to have a pretty big effect on him. But this idea that gets developed in Serral while he's there is one of simple life. This is a world where people still communicate with each other. People still talk to each other. People still walk around and have interactions. People are still living a fairly non-industrial life. And this is something that Tolkien takes to heart. This is something that he really begins to identify with. This sort of slower, paced, quiet life where you're able to go walk around nature. You're able to still ride your bike everywhere. You can, walk up and down the street and know everybody's name. This is a big impression on a young Ronald. And what's going to happen while they're living there is that he starts picking up a lot of the regional slang. So if you go anywhere in the larger UK, you'll probably know that there are lots of different dialects of English. Everybody speaks what we might consider English or Gaelic or Welsh or whatever language they might maybe speak normally, but there's a lot of regional dialects. And in this sort of West Midlands slang, you're going to run into words that a young Ronald is going to pick up on for the first time. For example, Gamgee. which is actually named after a particular inventor who made a particular type of cotton wool that could be used to close up wounds on a battlefield. But Gamgee becomes a Serral slang for cotton wool. And this is the earliest evidence where we start finding real usage of this West Midlands basic life really show up very, very clearly in The Lord of the Rings. And this is also a little bit of a foreshadowing of what we might talk a little bit more about on our fourth installment, where Tolkien really enjoys using words in puns. And if you know anything about Sam Gamgee, who is, of course, the sort of second protagonist to Lord of the Rings, he, at the end of the book, marries Rosie Cotton. So here we have Gamgee, which means cotton, marrying Cotton, which is just one of these little hidden nuggets of greatness that Tolkien drops in his writing that go unnoticed unless you really understand where he's coming from and how he's writing all of this stuff. So he's already thinking about this. All of this is sort of going into the pot. Now, when he gets a little bit older, his mom is going to begin teaching both boys at home. And this is partially because their family is fairly broke. Because by this point, Arthur has died. Arthur never came back to England after Hilary and Ronald and Mabel left. They never saw Arthur again. He died in February of 1896 from rheumatic fever, caused a blood hemorrhage, and he died there. And he was buried in South Africa. And what he left behind was basically some shares in some of the businesses in South Africa that would draw a yearly amount of money that could sort of keep Mabel on her feet. But this was not a large sum. And one of the things that was going to be a theme for young Ronald's life is living right on the edge of poverty and having to rely on the support of others, specifically his Suffield family members on his mom's side. But when it's time for them to go to school, Mabel is going to end up doing a lot of the schooling early on, because the system back then was a little bit different than it is now. You actually had to take tests to get into your even your primary schools back then. And there was a specific one in Birmingham that Mabel really wanted her sons to go to. This is a school called King Edward's. It was a very prominent school at the time. So Mabel's going to start teaching whatever she can. And she teaches botany, which is a subject that Ronald really loves. Specifically, he really loves trees. And this is going to be a theme in his world and his life. And if you've ever wondered why trees appear so frequently and even walk around in his stories, this is where he gets a lot of this stuff from. She's going to begin teaching him language. He's going to learn Latin and French. He's not particularly very fond of French, but when he's reading Latin and the earliest stuff, when he's getting exposed to the Greek classics, this would be translations of the Greek classics, he's going to end up reading Plato's dialogues. And if you've read Plato's dialogues, you'll know that in a couple of them, the story of Atlantis pops up. And when Ronald reads this, it has a big impact on him. And the idea of this giant wave is going to start almost haunting him. He has this recurring dream of water just sort of rushing in and destroying everything on the land. And he becomes sort of fascinated with this concept of Atlantis. Maybe not necessarily with the the existence of it, but this concept of a civilization that was living on an island that was blessed by the gods that then gets destroyed by the gods. This is something that is going to have a big impact on him later on when we start writing stuff about perhaps like Numenor, if you know anything about the story of the Kingdom of Numenor. Now, he's also going to read the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Both of these are, classic stories of what we might consider the good old-fashioned classics curriculum, where Odysseus goes about his journey, Aeneas goes about his journey, and Aeneas ends up founding Rome, and these great epic tales of fighting monsters and facing long odds and coming out on top because of wit. These are things that are going to impress Ronald quite a bit. But this is going to be the first kind of early moment where he starts to realize that there's something a little bit different about the way that he wants to view the world. And he starts thinking about how there aren't necessarily a lot of stories that talk about England that way. And his mom's actually going to come through and get him quite a few books that are going to help him along the way, including the books of this gentleman named George MacDonald. So George MacDonald was a writer that lived from 1824 to 1905, and he wrote quite a few books that would fall well within what we would call today fairy tales. Two books in particular of MacDonald's are going to be very important for young Ronald. One of them is The Princess and the Goblin, which was published in 1872, and The Princess and Curdie, which was published in 1883. Now, in these stories, MacDonald has brought together a lot of elements of what we might call, high medieval romance, but also elements of fairy tales and supernatural powers. But when you read these stories, what you can find are themes that begin to pop up in lots of other places. For example, a lot of the stuff that happens in these books involves underground mines that are full of goblins. And one of the characters, the main character, the protagonist, is going to receive a magic ring from her grandmother, who tells this story about this sort of lost lineage of history and power that used to be in the family, and this ring is going to be able to help her navigate in the tunnels. So we can already start seeing some parallels here between what we might find later on in stories like The Hobbit, right? The stories of George MacDonald are going to have a very big impact on Ronald. He's also going to read what he called Red Indian stories. Now, we're not sure exactly what these were, but at the time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, one of the big genres going around were stories that involved Native Americans, specifically stuff like Hiawatha. And we do know that he eventually read Hiawatha, and it's quite possible that stuff like that were what he referred to when he said that he read the Red Indian stories. But there are some themes in those Native American stories that are fairly common. For example, these journeys along rivers, right, in canoes. There are epic battles with powers that are beyond mere mortals, where mortals are able to come out on top. And there are stories of tracking through the woods, where a person that may be a character in one of these books goes through the process of killing an animal or stalking the animal and then hunting it after being shot and following blood trails and signs and things like that. So if you're familiar with Tolkien's work, can already see how this might have sort of added to the collection of ideas that are all swirling in his mind. So he's also going to read the Arthurian legends, which he does fall in love with almost immediately. And he's also going to read some of the work of this gentleman here, whose name is Andrew Lang. Now, Andrew Lang was a very important writer in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and one of the things that he was most noted for was a very long series of fairy books. And these books are going to be colored. So there's the yellow fairy book and the blue fairy book, and etc. The one that Ronald loved particularly was the red fairy book. And the red fairy book became especially important for him because of one of the stories that it contained. And this was a translation and a sort of retelling of the great story of Sigurd and Fafnir. So this, of course, is the story of a Germanic warrior who fights a dragon and through cunning and skill manages to slay the dragon after it causes a lot of havoc. And this is going to begin Ronald's fascination with the concept of dragons. And this is actually going to lead him to write some of his first fiction. And around 1899, he's going to write a very rough outline of a story where the protagonist has to fight this great green dragon. And he is very proud of this story and gives it to his mother, asking for his mother's opinion. And Mabel gives him some constructive criticism. And Ronald doesn't take this very well. This is also going to start a trend where Mabel's notes on the story are received initially with some level of, courtesy, but this is actually going to stop Ronald from writing for quite a long time. And I don't think it was intentional on Mabel's part to do so, but this is going to cause him to develop this idea that, whoa, I guess I need to work on things more before I show them to people so that I can get stuff perfect. And this is going to also be a recurring theme, right? So by the time we get to 1900, once again, the financial situation that Ronald is facing is one that's very, very, very bad. Mabel is going to actually take steps during this time period to cause a bit of estrangement between herself and her family because she's going to convert to Catholicism. Now, her family had been, at least on paper, Anglican for the majority of her life. And this conversion to Catholicism was something that she felt very deeply that she needed to do, but it was not something that was supported very much by her family. And this is going to further strain the financial situation, and Tolkien and his family are going to end up being more reliant on the church. And one thing that's sort of, I guess, worth noting here, when Tolkien starts writing about the Shire, which again is this period of time where he's living in Serral, is the biggest, I guess, inspiration for that. The Shire is divided into 4, and they're called farthings. So there's the north, south, east, and west farthing. Now, a farthing is a quarter of a penny. So 4 farthings would be a penny. So the cost of the Shire is a penny, which it's unfortunate. Unfortunately, they're going to have to move away from Serral, and this is going to be due to financial situations and strains. They're going to end up having to move in with one of Tolkien's aunts. This is Aunt May, and they're going to move to a place first just nearby at Moseley, but then they're actually going to have to move back closer to the Suffield family. During the time that he lives at King's Heath, he lives fairly close to a railroad, and he has a memory of watching the train cars go by and noticing that some of the writing on some of the train cars was in a different language. And upon a little bit of ask and research, he finds out that These words are in the Welsh language. And this is going to be an early point where he starts to develop an understanding that there are lots of different languages spoken in a very close area. And that means that there are these layers of culture that exist in the same locations. And this is something that's going to be interesting. A lot of the names of places in Tolkien's work have Welsh backgrounds. For example, the Welsh word for hill is bre, and is B-R-E. And if you add another E to that, you end up with Bree, which of course is the city right outside of the Shire where you might stop at the Prancing Pony. So Bree Hill would then just be Hill. But this is something that's actually quite common in England, where you have things that are named things like River or Hill, but you use two different languages, right? Because of the overlap of cultures in these locations over time. So things are getting a little bit better, and he does manage to get into a decent school, but by 1904, tragedy is going to hit pretty hard. And his mother is going to end up getting diagnosed with diabetes. This is, of course, before there's any real treatment for diabetes. This is before insulin was something that you could buy off the shelf. And Mabel is going to have to go to hospital for quite some time. While she's in the hospital, the boys are going to get split up. And this is not something that either of them particularly like, but Hilary is going to end up going to live with the Suffields, and Ronald is going to live with one of his other aunts, Aunt Jane. And Mabel is in the hospital for several months. She manages to get out in June, but she's very, very weak. And as a way to try to recover, the local Catholic Church is going to extend the offer for Mabel and the boys to move to this little cottage in a place called Rednall. And this is by a group of hills known as the Lickey Hills. And for about the next 5 or 6 months, there's going to be a little bit of a recapturing of the magic, because when they had moved away from Serral, they had moved into places that were much busier, that didn't have that same natural aspect. And Rednall countryside and the Lickey Hills are going to be sort of one last grand hoorah with Mom and Hilary in the countryside. But in November of 1904, Mabel is going to pass into a diabetic coma, and on the 14th of November in 1904, she's going to die. And this is something that has an enormous impact on Ronald's life. He really attributes a lot of his pessimism to this moment. He's also going to look at this a little bit as a martyrdom. We'll talk about that a little bit more in our fourth installment. But this has a humongous impact, because the person that had been most important to him is now going to be out of the picture. And how do you cope with this? Well, there's going to be a period of time for the next 4 years where Hilary and Ronald are going to get bounced around quite a bit. They're first going to get to move in with one of their relatives, Beatrice Suffield, in the middle of a city. And Ronald absolutely hated being in the city. He did not like the view from the windows. He did not like the noisiness of the cars. And it's during this time period in early 1905 that he's going to start sort of merging this idea of this idyllic life in the countryside with missing his mother. And he sort of starts longing for this period of time when things were slower and in the country and less noisy, and this sort of crystallizes in his mind as what the West Midlands should be. So he creates this moment in time in the late 1800s that sort of gets frozen. And if you look at any of the writings that involve hobbits or the Shire, you'll see that they're not really motivated to industrialize. They're not really trying to push the boundaries of invention. They're just happy being happy. And this is a really powerful idea, right? This early concept of being quiet and being simple and being still is going to have lasting impact. He does manage to take a few trips. We'll talk about those a little bit in future discussions. For example, he goes to Lyme with Father Francis. I guess I should show Father Francis. I guess I've missed Father Francis. Apologies, just one second. First off, from around this time, here's a photo of Ronald and Hillary. So this is Ronald here on the left, Hillary on the right. This is a photograph from around 1905. Both of them had managed to get into King Edward's School, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. But at the death of their mother, they're going to pass into the care of this gentleman. This is their caretaker, Father Francis, who is the priest at the Birmingham Oratory. And this is going to basically be the center of their life now. Going to church, being in the care of these people is going to change so frequently that what really becomes sort of the center is their relationship with Father Francis. And this is going to have a big impact later on when Tolkien wants to do stuff like date and get married, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. But Father Francis is going to manage to take the boys on some trips to the sea, which is going to have a really big impact on Tolkien's concept of what the sea means. And we'll talk about that in just a bit when we look at some of the pictures of the places that he went to. But by the time we get to 1908, he is going to move into a boarding house that is owned by a lady named Mrs. Faulkner that's just right around the corner from the oratory. And in 1908, he is going to meet this young lady. This is his future wife. Her name is Edith Bratt. And this is a photograph of her in 1906. And she was living in the boarding house with Mrs. Faulkner as well. And almost immediately upon moving in, they are going to strike up a friendship. Now, it's notable that Edith was several years older than Ronald, and he was, of course, at this time, very, very young, right? So it's not necessarily something like he is a young Casanova and he is sweeping her off of her feet or anything like that. At this time, he would have only been about 14 or 15. So, young love. But it's a good connection, and we'll talk about that a lot more in the second one. Now, he does manage to get out and travel a little bit outside of the country. Now, this is not something that he actually enjoyed too terribly much. He ended up going to France and Spain as a translator with some of his connections in the area, but he has an unfortunate period of bad luck when it comes to travel. And one of the situations, one of the people that were in his tour group gets hit by a car and dies. So he doesn't really like Spain that much. He was upset that his Spanish was not up to snuff. He particularly did not like his time in France. And it's not really until he manages to make a big trip in 1911 to the Alps that some of Europe, continental Europe, really has a mark on him. And these trips into the mountains are going to be particularly important. They're going to be very impactful into his life. And on one of these trips, he's going to buy this particular postcard. So this postcard is Derbergeist, and it's by a painter called Madlener. And what we see here is an old man who is sitting on a stone in the middle of the woods with a big hat and a big beard, and he's feeding this deer. And there are owls looking on and mountains in the distance. And Tolkien particularly liked this image, and he kept this postcard for quite some time. He didn't actually send it, he just kept it. And when asked later on why this particular image was so important to him, this is, of course, well into his life, he says, "This is Gandalf." So this particular image might have been the original germ of Gandalf. So trips through the mountains with, nature all around you, that shows up quite a few times in his writings again, right? So also in 1911, when he returns from the trip, he's going to start at Oxford, specifically at Oxford's department reading classics. So this is basically what we would call today his major. The system was a little bit different back then, and even today, university in England is quite a bit different than what a lot of people are familiar with in the United States. But when you got into classics, you would basically read the old languages, your Greek and your Latin, and this is not particularly going to be his favorite thing. Now, he doesn't have the best of time at school, and we'll talk about it a lot more when we get to tomorrow, both tomorrow and the next day's discussions. He's not able to attend by himself. This is also a sticking point. He's still quite reliant on gifts from the church to help pay his tuition. And this is going to be a bit of a distinguishing point, because one of the things that was quite popular at university at that time was to invite everybody over and buy food for them. So you bring all of your buddies over and you buy food, and you sort of, wine and dine everyone. But Tolkien didn't have the money to do this. And he was always just sort of one step out of what he felt was kind of the group in a lot of these situations. But he does get access to a library. And the library at Oxford is going to be one of the turning points in his life, because he's going to discover not just this interest in this West Midlands dialect, but its ties back to Anglo-Saxon, the old language, what we call today Old English. And he's going to find in a particular work called Christ by the Anglo-Saxon poet Cynewulf a particular line. And this line is going to be incredibly important because it is the beginning of Middle-earth. And in the poem Christ, there's a long description of all of these things. Of course, it's very religious in nature. But in the beginning of one of the stanzas, there's this line that says, "Hail Arundel, brightest of angels." And if you're familiar with the named Arundel from Tolkien's mythology, you'll know that this guy actually does go on to become the brightest of the stars in the sky. But this is a turning point, because at this point Ronald realizes that he needs to get out of the philology world, get out of the classics world, and he needs to read and work on a degree in English. And this is something of a departure, because when he was being brought up and taught by his mother, he had grown to sort of appreciate the classics, but he had always sort of felt, again, like there was something missing that was specifically English, this sort of sense of history and this depth of time. And he's going to find that when he gets into reading English. And one of the things that he's going to run into in his English department is that there are sort of two halves. There are those that are interested in the Old English and those that are interested in more modern English. And even in 1911, 12, 13, when he's sort of finding his way as this early master of Anglo-Saxon literature, that he doesn't really care very much for the modern stuff. And this isn't necessarily something that should be surprising, because again, it plays back to this idea that in his mind, the ideal England is the old England, right? It's this sort of slow, localized, small-scale village England. And he doesn't like having to sit in the classes where he has to go read Shakespeare. Now, he does actually have to go read Shakespeare, which is not something that he cares for too terribly much, but there are things that play into that. For example, he commented later in his life that the first time he read Macbeth, he was very upset that the invading wood that shows up at the end when Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, right? He was upset that it wasn't the trees moving, that it was just people who had chopped off branches, and that it would have been a much better story if the trees had come to bring the judgment on Macbeth. And it's really ironic that he starts putting moving trees into his story that bring in all sorts of, judgment on the bad guys, right? So this love of Anglo-Saxon is going to be a very fast falling. He's going to just absolutely love them. And Middle-earth is going to be an outgrowth of Midgard, which is the Anglo-Saxon term for Middle-earth. Of course, this goes back to concepts of things like Midgard and all of the different levels of what we might call Norse mythology. But one of the things that he's going to start doing when he tries to build this idea of, Anglo-Saxon Old English mythology, he's going to find out that it's fairly empty and a lot of places need some filling in. And a lot of his earliest works are going to be trying to fill in these blanks, because he gets this germ of an idea that he could be the one that produces the work that is going to stand in as the English mythology. And he starts with Anglo-Saxon stories, and he's going to add Welsh and Celtic and Norse and Germanic stories on top of this, and starts building and crafting all of this, all of these ideas. So if we want to see a picture of him, you can see here. This is a picture of him in either 1911 or 1912. This would have been when he was just entering Oxford, so a young man, bright-eyed, ready to go. So there we go. Now, when we get to 1914, of course, there is a big war to deal with. And in fact, it's the Great War at that time, right? We'll talk more about Tolkien's stint in the war on part 2, but it is worth noting that when he got into the war, he was going to get in as an officer, but he was also going to go in rather late. There are some stories that he told from this time period where a lot of people expected him to go to war. He was unmarried. He was not of a lot of money, and those were the people that were expected to go to war. And Tolkien did resist signing up for quite some time, and there are some historians and some people that have criticized Tolkien for this by saying that he was too much in love with the idea of this Anglo-Saxon heritage, right? The Anglo-Saxons, of course, are Germanic peoples, and a lot of people previous have tried to paint Tolkien as some sort of German sympathizer, that he sort of identified with the Germans and their plight, or whatever you would want to say in this particular scenario. But I think it's fair to say that Tolkien was also very aware that if he didn't finish college, he was not going to have any money. He had cashed out all of the family's bonds that were in his name that he could pull. He was basically living off of the goodwill of the church, and he wanted to get married. He was at that time still very much in love with Edith and had begun to write letters to her again as soon as he hit 21. This was a guideline that Father Francis had put in place, that he couldn't court Edith until he was in an adulthood. So he wanted to get married, and he needed the money, he needed the income. So him staying at Oxford to finish his degree is not something that I would paint as anti-England or pro-German. I think it's much more practical because, again, Tolkien knew what poverty was like. He had lived on, again, the edge of poverty for the majority of his young life, and he didn't want to end up that way again. He knew that he needed to have a degree if there was any hope for him to support a family. But he does end up getting into the army in 1916. We have a picture of him here in his uniform. And it's worth noting that when he got into the army, because he had a degree, he was in the officer's rank. He came in as, well above the average English grunt when it came to rank. And this is going to allot him quite a bit of privilege. And it's not always privilege that he particularly cared for. So he doesn't really get along with the other officers. Most of the other officers were college educated and were from families of well-to-do means. He actually preferred spending time with just the average British soldier. But there were actually rules that he wasn't necessarily supposed to do that. He wasn't supposed to fraternize with the enlisted men, right? This was not something that he was going to be able to get away with very easily. But he does spend some time in World War I. We'll talk about that in part 2 extensively. He spends a lot of time in France. It's worth noting that once again, he doesn't particularly care for French food. He thinks it's too rich. And this again might just be that he's this simple kind of country English boy that was from the West Midlands that thought food should not look like French food. But this is going to have a big impact on him, of course, and we'll talk about this again extensively in part 2. But when he gets out of the war, he ends up with trench fever, and he gets honorably discharged, and the war ends, of course, in 1918, and then he's going to pick up other work that we'll talk about in part 3. But by the time we get to the early 1920s, at this point he's married, he has a couple of children, and we might ask, what is he doing? What's he up to? Is he still living that simple lifestyle? And the answer is absolutely he is. Even with his family, he's really not big on big touristy holidays. In 1922, for example, they go on a vacation to the Yorkshire coast. And this is a beautiful location. And while he loves the scenery, this is at a location called Philly, where he spends some time. He would rather look at the coastline and paint pictures than he would do any of the touristy stuff. And while his family goes and does touristy stuff, he actually sits in their vacation home and grades papers. Now, this is partially because he had to grade papers as a way to fill in additional income, but it's also just he didn't really want to go be the tourist. He preferred things to be quiet and simple. So by the time we get to the early 1920s, the family is going to get into a comfortable rhythm. And one of the things that is actually going to be interesting to Tolkien is visiting his brother. Instead of going to what we might call the vacation spots, Tolkien's very much going to prefer to visit Hillary. Hillary had bought a small orchard at a place called Blackminster, which is near Evesham in Worcestershire. And if we look at pictures of this area, we can see how this would appeal to Tolkien's love, right? We have these small rolling hills. We have little fields that are lined with trees. There's a river that runs through the area. This is the River Avon. And life in this area was just very quiet and sort of idyllic. And this was the sort of thing that Ronald really appreciated. He would much rather go to Evesham and spend time at the orchard picking fruit in the quiet rolling hills of the West Midlands than he would going to the coast and dealing with all of the other screaming people, right? So he just really likes this sort of simple lifestyle. And one of the other places that he likes to go visit is actually Bag End. His Aunt Jane lived at a place called Bag End. This is actually the name of the building in the area. This is another one of these sort of quiet little country houses where, you left the hustle and the bustle of the city behind and you got to experience a quieter and more subdued England. And this is what he wants and what he likes. And if we look at some of the other pictures that we get from Bag End, you can see that this, other than having multiple stories, looks very Shire-like. We've got our little ponies and we've got our berry bushes and our little outbuildings and our thatched roofs, and things are quiet and there's not smoke in the sky. And this was again Tolkien sort of trying to find this quiet, peaceful, simple stuff. By the late 1923 area, he's actually going to write a poem that's called Progress in Bimbletown. And the work's purpose is basically to tear apart tourism. That there's this little quiet place called Bimbletown, and all of these tourists start showing up, and basically it's a satiric approach to progress, where he's saying that progress is actually destroying Bimbletown as opposed to making it better. And this is going to be something that, makes his position fairly well known to everybody, right? So when we talk about these simple things and we talk about where he's going to go and where he's going to live, he ends up becoming a professor fairly young at 32. This is a very young age to become a professor. And when he gets the opportunity to purchase his own house, he could buy one that's right next to the university, right downtown, right in the middle of everything. But instead, he picks this location at a place called Darnley Road in West Park that is a good bike ride away, but it's surrounded by fields because he wants to have places to go walk with the family, and he wants to have these moments where he can get away from stuff. And he actually quite liked riding his bicycle. He does eventually buy a car in 1932, and this is going to lead to one of his early stories that he wrote called Mr. Bliss. You can see here, this is actually an illustration that he did for the story. So this is Mr. Bliss's motor car. And it turns out that he was not the best of drivers. And one particular trip in 1932 to visit Hillary scares everybody in the car to death so much that they don't want to ride with him again. And the story about Mr. Bliss involves him crashing the motor car. And here we can see him running into a cabbage dealer who is knocked off of his feet backwards, and the car, of course, is going to be the culprit and the cause of all of this stuff. And again, it's because he doesn't really ever fit in with this modernized stuff. He doesn't ever really get this idea that you have to, progress for the sake of it. He wants to be slow and he wants to be methodical. So he doesn't actually keep the car for very long. During World War II, he sells it, and he, according to him, never drives a car again. Now, he rides in cars, but never personally drives one again after that point. But when he gets access to this car and he starts driving around again, one of the things that he does is decides that he wants to go visit his family in Birmingham. And this is actually a very sad story because he's going to write in his journal that he kept extensively throughout his life that when he drove back through Serral again, he was sort of hoping to relive that feeling of being in the quiet, simple life. But the city had become completely unrecognizable. There were none of the trees around the pools anymore, that everything had grown up and become very automated and modern, that there were too many buildings made out of bricks. He commented that there were too many bricks. And he starts equating this concept of progress with the fall of man. And this is going to have a lot of impact on stuff that he would write later, of course. If you look at the dwarves who mine too deep and they awake the nameless fear that then kills them, or the Númenóreans who seek wisdom and turn to Sauron to give it to them, which ends up being great progress, and they become very powerful and expand their empire, but this also leads to their downfall. And of course, most notably at the end of Lord of the Rings, when you read the story, you'll know that the hobbits come back and the Shire has been scoured and the trees have been cut down, and then there are ugly buildings that are made out of poorly laid brick, and the idyllic concepts have been ruined by this concept of progress. The larger story that we're going to get from this period of time where he's watching all of this stuff happen is going to directly relate to his view of a human's relationship with the world around them. And if you know anything about Tolkien's writings, there is a special connection, especially between elves and the world and certain types of men and the world, and hobbits and the world. And in his writings in Middle Earth, this is actually described as a type of magic. And this is sort of the impetus behind this concept that, we're not supposed to do all of these big wheels and spitting smoke into the sky, and we're not supposed to push forward and do all this new stuff. And a lot of people would probably classify this as Tolkien just being hidebound and stuck in his ways, and maybe even a Luddite or something like that. Incorrect use of the term Luddite there. But, the idea is one that is quite powerful in a lot of Tolkien's writings. And it's actually during this time that he starts writing a story called Farmer Giles of Ham. And Farmer Giles of Ham is one of his first attempts at writing a full-length story set in an ancient time that directly relates to the area that he's living in. So in the area around Oxford where he's living, there are certain landmarks and certain concepts and certain ideas and slang terms and things like that. And as an attempt at writing a mythological explanation for these, Tolkien writes Farmer Giles. And it explains why this hill is named this way and why this particular location is called this and what this responds to and how the stories affected the world. And this is going to be something that plays directly into the growing mythology of Middle-earth and overall Tolkien's concept of how he approaches not only his fictional writing but also his scholarly work. Because what he's doing on his scholarly side, which we'll talk about extensively in part 3, is trying to work on these languages and piece these languages together and sift languages back and forth and show how languages have changed over time. But there's also this very real element of place and geography and living in the story that you're writing. And Tolkien was very aware of this stuff and put a lot of effort into trying to preserve what he thought was the best that England had to offer. Now, when he starts trying to work on stuff, by this point, The Hobbit had already been published. And if you're wondering when we're going to talk about, the big books like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, that's mostly going to be in part 4. But by the late 30s, when he starts writing or starts thinking about a sequel to The Hobbit, which of course everybody wanted, one of the things that he started thinking about was how he was going to write about the origin of the Shire. Where did the Shire come from? And if you read the introductory works that he writes, before The Lord of the Rings, there are several pieces of literature. One of them is about how the Shire got settled. And you'll find in these that there are 2 brothers, Marcho and Blanco, that are going to move to the Shire. But in Tolkien's languages that he made up, Marcho and Blanco are 2 words that both mean horse. And you're like, okay, well, who cares about, horses? What is that? Why do we care about horses? Well, in the old Germanic and Old English stories, the 2 Anglo-Saxons that founded English, or founded their Anglo-Saxon territory in England were guys named Hengist and Horsa, which also both mean horse. So what we get here is Tolkien going, okay, the Shire is good old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon England. And I want my founders to both be named Horse, because the Anglo-Saxons that founded the colonies in England were also named Horse. And if you look at the divisions of hobbits, you'll know that there are 3. There are Followhides and Harfoots and Stoors. And if you know anything about those particular groups, you'll know some of them live in elven territory closer with elves. Some of them are closer friends with men, or some of them are capable of growing chin fur, etc. But these 3 groups of original hobbits are going to be parallels to the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, the three Germanic peoples that come to settle in England. Because again, he was bringing this sense of who he was. He was an Anglo-Saxon, West Midlands Englishman. And he was trying to make his world in fiction match his world in person. Now, when we get to World War II, this is going to be further kind of sadness for Tolkien. He had written Farmer Giles and was actually working on a sequel. But during the Battle for Britain, the German Luftwaffe bombs the heck out of Oxfordshire. And a lot of the places that were touchstones between Farmer Giles and the real-life Oxford end up getting blown to smithereens. And as Tolkien sort of goes around and surveys these areas, it breaks his heart. And it hurts him so bad that he basically gives up on the sequel to Farmer Giles, which the publishers has already told him that they would publish. Again, during this time, he also sells his car because it was just easier. There was a lot of gas rationing going on in World War II, so he just sells it. And if there are any people wondering how he felt about Germans, or the German cause in World War II, so I mentioned back when we were talking about World War I that some writers and historians have claimed that Tolkien was a little bit perhaps sympathetic with the German cause in World War I. It is very clear that he did not care for the German cause in World War II at all. He specifically hated the fact that the Nazis had basically perverted Anglo-Saxon mythology and turned it into something that was racist and hateful. And in one particular letter, he refers to Hitler as a ruddy little ignoramus, and didn't have 2 cents for him because of this damage that Tolkien felt he had done to the larger concept of what Anglo-Saxon was. Of course, we all know now that the propaganda stuff that came out from the Nazis was obviously, slanted and jilted, and it wasn't actually accurate to the original stories. But one of the things that came out of Nazi Germany was this rededication to old Germanic stories. The great Viking tales and the Volsung saga and all of the Wagner operas and things like that, where you have these great Anglo-Saxon Germanic warriors fighting the bad guys. And of course the Nazis played that into their larger ideology, and Tolkien absolutely hated that because he said that that's not what Anglo-Saxons were in the first place. Now, one might think that after the success of these books and Tolkien basically not having to worry about money anymore, that he would get, maybe the big head. Maybe he would dramatically change himself. We had this idea that money is the corrupter of people. But he actually moved out of the city. He purposely moved well out of the city. This is a place called Sandfield Road. This is 76 Sandfield Road. And I would note, while it is a sizable house, right, it is not what we might call a mansion. This is not something that is going to, break the bank. But specifically, this was out of the way because he was getting too many people walking up and knocking on his door. He felt rather in the spotlight, and he didn't always really like that spotlight. Being somebody that everybody immediately recognized was not somebody that really fit Ronald Tolkien. In fact, when he finally got the first draft of Lord of the Rings finished, The publishers asked him to mail it, and Ronald was like, I'm not going to put this in the post. I'll bring it to you, or you can come get it, but I want to hand this to you." And the publishers got a little bit disturbed by this, and we're trying to meet deadlines, and we've got all these edits to do and all this stuff going on, and he still just wanted to do everything by hand. He typed the original manuscript to Lord of the Rings on a typewriter that he put on his lap, typically while he was in bed, and he typed with 2 fingers, one at a time. And he hunt and pecked out the entire first draft of Lord of the Rings that way, because he didn't want to hire a typist. And he also didn't want to learn how to use a typewriter. He still preferred answering letters by hand in most situations. Because again, he was just a simple kind of guy. He was this West Midlands, not used to having money kind of person. And when it comes to, the fame that he got, he ends up selling a lot of the stuff that we might consider timeless relics for what would basically be steals. The original manuscripts for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were sold for $1,250. This was in 1957, so 1957 money is obviously a little bit more than it is today. But even so, $1,250 is not a lot for the original physical first drafts of these books. And it wasn't one book, it was all of his books that had been published so far. And he sold these because he didn't really need the money. He just wanted to pay his taxes. He actually didn't like the fact that he was getting all of these residuals and these royalties because his taxes kept going up, and he hated taxes. And he figured out that if he sold these manuscripts, he could get some money to pay off of his tax bill. So he's not really somebody that's, breaking the bank on stuff. Okay, so $15,000 in today's money, according to our translation, that's not a lot of money. If those went up for auction today, those would be worth millions of dollars. But he sold them because he just hated taxes and wanted to get out from under it. He became a person that everybody knew. And he never really let it go to his head. There were people across Europe that tried all of the time to get him to come to events where they were going to give him honorary doctorates, or they were going to, give him some sort of award, like a Lifetime Achievement Award. They were going to give him some big celebratory banquet and have him do some reading or stuff like that. And he refused almost all of them because first off, he didn't want to travel. He didn't want to go back to France. He didn't want to go to Spain. He didn't want to go to Italy. He only went to 1 or 2 of these, and one of them was in Holland in 1958, and he says that he had a good enough time on that, but he wasn't really necessarily, interested in doing a whole bunch of these. So, it wasn't really something that he was gung-ho about. Now, you might say, okay, he moves out to the country. He doesn't want to be around everybody. How is he handling this on a personal level? Well, on a personal level, he didn't really seem to change that much. He did allow himself one small indulgence, and that is that he allowed himself to buy colored vests. So he was very frequently in the what you might consider standard Oxford Don outfit of the tweed suit, but his single indulgence was that he allowed himself to buy brightly colored vests, and occasionally one that had bright buttons. And if you know anything about the story of The Hobbit, you'll know that one of the great losses of Bilbo's travels were his shiny buttons on his vest. Because again, he's a hobbit, right? So he also gets all this fan mail. Thousands and thousands of letters from people from all over the world that are asking him questions and trying to clarify things and trying to get him to explain stuff, and all of these different questions and stories, and wanting to connect with the author. And for the large majority of his life, he answered every letter that he got by hand. Now, later on in his life, his publisher did actually have a person on staff that helped him with fan mail, but he still wanted to read all of them himself, and he still wanted to make sure that he could properly answer their questions, and he wanted to make sure that he could give them this one-on-one touch, because he didn't want to feel impersonal, right? He didn't want everybody to think that he was just some aloof, I guess, celebrity status person, right? He just was a guy that wanted to talk to his fans. And this relationship that he had with his fan base was actually quite remarkable, and it's going to end up paying off quite a bit when there's an unauthorized version of The Hobbit that gets released in America. Tolkien's lawyers and the publishing company want to try to make this big deal out of it, and they're trying to push him to edit this document so that he can publish a new version of paperback stuff in America. And what he ends up doing is just responding to his fan mail. And when people from America will write him, he'll answer their letter, and he'll just write in there, also, by the way, this particular version of The Hobbit that's put out by Ace Books is not authorized. Please tell all of your friends not to purchase it. And that ends up tanking the sales of the unauthorized version of The Hobbit way faster than the legal route and the hubbub and the suing and the cross-filing of letters and such. He just tells his fans, hey, it would be a big deal for me if you all stopped buying this book. And because he had put so much effort into building these relationships with his fans, that mobilized a grassroots boycott of the unauthorized version that ended up with the publisher who had put out the book without the rights paying back money to Tolkien's publishers for every copy that they had sold, because they lost their rear end in it. It's just like this quiet, unassuming guy that didn't want a loud noise, didn't necessarily want to have to drag things through court, just says, hey, let's talk to the people. Let's do things the slow way. Now, he really doesn't like television. He saw television as something that was a little bit too much progress. And he never really watched a lot of TV. The only time that he ever watched any sort of TV for any length was after his wife died. He would sometimes go spend time with his brother, and his brother had a TV, and they might watch some things together. But he didn't really like TV, and he didn't really like the idea of putting his work into live action. There were American movie producers that had tried literally coming to his house unasked for and knocking on the door to get some version of movie for The Lord of the Rings or for The Hobbit. And he was just never going to give them the okay. At one point, he was answering a letter or in conversation with about the Hobbit and whether or not it could be put into movie form. and the particular people asking were this American company, and he said, I've never, the American companies just aren't there. And he specifically said, he called out Disney being so bad. He's like, we especially don't want Disney getting their hands on it, because that would be especially horrible. So he constantly resists this stuff. Now, the BBC does manage to get some things done on the radio. Tolkien was not completely anti-radio. There were moments of his life, of course, where he was very dependent on the radio. In fact, his job in World War I was as a signals officer, where he was on the radio all the time. So this was something that sort of was allowable technology to Tolkien's world. But that doesn't mean that he necessarily liked it very much. The BBC produced several different versions of his works in dramatic radio plays, and he really didn't like any of them. So he's just not somebody that really gets into this sort of newfangled way of doing stuff. He would have preferred people to sit down with the book and read it, and he wrote the book to be read that way, right? Now, when we get to the end of his life, by the time we get to the late part of 1972, he got diagnosed with some gastrointestinal issues. Particularly, he got diagnosed with this thing called dyspepsia. And when he got on dyspepsia, or when he got diagnosed with dyspepsia, he had to go on a very, very particular diet. And the diet was just not one that sat well with him. He didn't like having to eat specific kinds of foods. He wanted to be able to go do food the way that he wanted to do it. It just wasn't really something that sat with him very well. But he does end up dying in 1973. We'll talk about the actual moment of his death a little bit in part 2. But in summation of what we've talked about tonight, what I really hope has come across in this particular installment is how Tolkien thought about himself and how Tolkien thought about the world that he was writing in, right? So if we look at Tolkien here, this is him right around towards the end of his life, smoking a pipe, doing his thing, smiling. But Tolkien was a man that really thought of himself as this sort of West Midlander. He was quiet. He didn't necessarily like the speedy bustle and hustle of a town. And he had roots that ran well deep into history. He thought of himself as a reviver of the Anglo-Saxon mythology. And he thought of himself as the person who had been tasked with compiling this multi-generational, multicultural tapestry of British mythology into one unified history of England that would allow them to have a story set that would put them on par with other countries. They didn't have an Odyssey, or they didn't have an Aeneid. And he wanted to do that because to him, that's what was important. The land that he lived in and the places that he had experienced left these really deep marks on his life. And he took that as a burden, and he took that as a calling to just be the proper English gentleman, but not necessarily the one that's going to live in the big house, but the one that's going to, invite you over for beans and toast or something like that, right? And from his earliest life with his mom and the adventures in Serral with his brother and all the way through these experiences that he had, where he was developing this concept of himself as just the regular English guy. He's going to weave these elements into his writing. And this is really going to shape not just what he writes, but how he writes it, how he thinks about it, and how he wants other people to think about it. So that has been part one of our 4-part series. And we'll be doing these for the next 3 nights in a row. And the discussion tomorrow is about his circles of friends. The discussion on Saturday is going to be about his academic work, and then the discussion on Sunday is going to be sort of a discussion about how he thought of himself as a writer and what he thought about when it came to what writing was and what writing meant. So that wraps us up